This is the podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, where the world's voices converge, from ambassadors to analysts, from Houston to every corner of the globe. We go beyond the headlines, bringing you direct insights into diplomacy, global events, and the international forces shaping our future. Because understanding the world starts with listening to it.
Thank you, Jahan, and thank you all for coming. Ambassador Gavin, it's wonderful to have you. I really enjoyed and appreciated this book because I will say, probably like a lot of people, I feel reasonably comfortable with what's happening in China, Russia, Middle East, parts of Latin America. I think Africa, you discuss it at length in the book, is something as a country we, for better or worse, Democratic and Republican presidents haven't always done the best job with. And just for people to understand, Africa has more countries than anywhere, 54 countries, most of any continent. You're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, so we're, all of Africa except for the northern African countries, those 5 that are on the Mediterranean. But what I really liked about your book is it's not overly flowery and optimistic that we might have had 10, 15 years ago when people say, look at this great growth in youth, this incredible growth in education, Africa rising, all those kind of monikers people used. Or conversely, the really ugly, pessimistic side, Afro-pessimism of maybe some of the hard-right politicians in Europe and places like that. But really, a realistic and frank and open discussion of what's happening in Africa right now, and in particular, with regards to youth and the urban youth. Can you talk about this is a unique moment, really, in world history. The percentage of youth in Africa is unlike anything we've ever seen. They're much better educated than before. They are active, they are connected, but they are also frustrated with their governments. And can you maybe talk about, from your own experiences as an ambassador, working on African issues before that, what inspired you to kind of take on this big challenge?
Okay, that was a lot, but we'll get to it. But first, let me just say thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be invited to be here, and I learned so much from talking to people sort of outside the government and think tank bubble. So I was really looking forward to this, and I'm delighted to be here. So yes, there is something very singular about African demographics. And we've all probably heard this term youth bulge, right? The big youth bulge. But often we sort of shorthand what a demographic dividend looks like when you have a lot of young people. A demographic dividend, meaning a big boost to your national productivity, occurs when you have lots of young people in the labor force and relatively few dependents. That means children or the elderly. And that's not what's happening in most of Africa right now. You have these very rapidly growing populations. Soon, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. But the dependency ratios are quite different because the population growth has not started to taper off. So what that means is more and more young people joining the labor force every year and not anything close to enough jobs. So we had this Africa rising narrative about a dozen years ago. If I went to one Africa open for business meeting, I probably went to 10. That often sort of said, oh, look at this, there's this great youth bulge, and it's going to power these countries forward. And it's a really kind of fundamental misunderstanding of the demographic challenge that so many African states confront right now. One reason I wanted to write this book is despite the grave danger of trying to make an argument about a huge region, incredibly diverse in its history, culture, political economies, my own experience suggests to me there is a really interesting through line, a thread that you can pull across some very, very different political systems and geographies, and it's about the dissatisfaction that the majority of the population, which means young people, feels. So when I say the majority of the population, let's just get some basis of comparison. When you think about young people making a big impact politically, most of the Americans I talk to, their minds go to 1968, right? The country was changing rapidly. There were a lot of very strongly held views about our involvement in Vietnam. And you had a lot of civic activism that seemed to be spearheaded by young people. In 1968, the number of Americans ages 15 to 24, so not necessarily yet of voting age, but of political awareness, that cohort was about 23% of the total adult population. So we're lopping off the kids here. About 23% is big, right? This is called it a baby boom for a reason. If you think about the Arab Spring, Egypt, 2011, Tahrir Square, the Egyptian people rising up demanding change, it was often described as a youth-led movement. That cohort, that 15 to 24 cohort, was about 32% of the adult population. In over a dozen African countries today, that cohort is more than 60% of the adult population. In several, it's more than 70. This is not like these other situations. And so that's sort of point one. And that leads to a set of really challenging governance issues and incredibly challenging economic issues, right? Because creating jobs for that many young people is a very difficult mission, and it's particularly difficult right now for African governments to make the kinds of investments that might stimulate growth, particularly job-creating growth, because so many of them are dealing with massive debt servicing. So there are an awful lot of countries now that are spending more money servicing their debt, essentially paying interest, right, than they're able to spend on healthcare. We just reached a point where there's more, the amount of money flowing out of Africa to China to repay debts is now greater than the amount of Chinese investment coming into the continent. So just try and kind of imagine yourself charged with a leadership position in a country full of tremendously young people, and that labor force is going to get bigger exponentially every year. You have no fiscal space in which to effect a stimulus, and what you end up with is a cycle of popular grievance, an inability to meet popular demands, and often then repression of popular uprisings, which only feeds the grievance that much more.
And the flip side of the irony is the youngest population in the world, but some of the oldest politicians and governments in the world, not just if the technical president or prime minister, but a lot of times in essence, same parties in power for 20, 30, 40 years. Can you also talk about, I suppose, that aspect of it? And in terms of Americans' foreign policy, you mentioned various times in the book that we either conflated or prioritized stability over basically political development, over kind of effective government. And, you know, it's an old phrase. FDR may or may not have said it, but, you know, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Sure. You know, that applied a lot during the world, you know, Cold War, whether it was in Latin America or parts of the Middle East. What was kind of the role of how the U.S. approached that, in that we have, maybe you could talk about Paul Biya from Cameroon or others, of what it means in terms of the governments that are in power now?
Sure. So the first time I left the country, I was an undergraduate. I was going to go study abroad. Got my first passport. I was extremely excited about it. And I went off to Cameroon in West Central Africa. And I was super interested in the politics of the place. So spent a lot of time talking to people, about their government. And every restaurant, every hotel had the same portrait of their president, Paul Biya. He'd been president already for a dozen years when I was there, and it was very hard to get people to separate Paul Biya from the state, right? They seemed like one and the same. So if you take a look at me, you can tell I'm pretty far out of college, right? I've got a lot of gray hair. Paul Biya is still president of Cameroon. That's right. That's exactly right. Just won a 7th term in an election of no integrity. That's astounding, right? And so there is this really interesting phenomenon on the continent of these forever presidents, in some cases dynastic successions, these very powerful ruling parties, so that the individual at the top might change, but the party maintains its grip. You see this a lot in Southern Africa in particular. And what this creates is a sense of political stasis, right? This sort of a predictability. And I do think that for US policymakers, we've confused that with stability. I'm all for stability, don't get me wrong. I'm not some kind of enthusiast about instability. And you can't attract the kind of investment you need to create jobs if there's an atmosphere of instability and unpredictability. But what's happened is you end up with these very brittle orders that have existed for a very long time and are able to sustain themselves, in some cases through repression, in some cases through patronage. But that model is starting to falter because beneath that elite level, their society has changed so incredibly dramatically from when that worked. So the book talks about, there's been a lot of stasis. I think what's coming is a lot of change. And it's not just because populations are so young. It's also because Africa is also the most rapidly urbanizing part of the world. So you have young people increasingly concentrated in cities. We're just a few years out from more Africans living in urban centers than not. And that changes politics, right? It's much easier to organize politically in an urban center. It's also easier to develop a sense of relative deprivation. So if you're in a city, in an informal settlement, without access to reliable power, working in the informal sector, and in that same city, you can see how the elites of that society live. It's a very different thing from being out in the countryside. This is magnified by the advent of social media, digitization, the fact that Africans can see on their phones the way people live around the world. And there's a lot of comparison and also some really interesting conversations going on about how to affect change, how to create jobs. This is going on across borders, and this sense that there's a political space where these ideas can, in some cases, be more freely expressed, and also a space where you can find some sense of solidarity. So there's a bit of the emperor's new clothes element there, where somebody says it online, and suddenly it feels okay to say, I don't understand what this government is delivering for us. So there are those factors. And then the last one, I don't mean to go on too long, but sort of gets at where you started, is we've had these long-serving leaders and parties and systems, and they come with a certain legitimacy narrative, right? So the big wave of democratization that came across the continent at the end of the Cold War, in some cases took deep root, in some cases incredibly shallow roots, right? Where you have election-like events and it gets called democracy. But the legitimacy narratives are pretty deeply rooted. So in some cases, it's sometimes very explicitly, for example, in Zimbabwe, it's the ruling party, ZANU-PF, is in charge, and it will always be in charge because we delivered this country from the grotesque injustice of minority rule when Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia. And that's, so it's not really that we get the most votes in the election. They do have elections. The elections are not free and fair. But that's not really at the core of the political narrative about why the people who are in charge, right? At the core is, well, we're ZANU-PF and we delivered the country. But most Zimbabweans were born after Zimbabwe was free from minority rule, that it's less resonant for them. This is most famous, I think, in South Africa, right, where the ANC has lost its absolute majority for the first time in the last general election. And it was so interesting to watch that ANC campaign because you had multiple figures on the stump talking about how much better the country was at that point than it had been under apartheid. And yes, absolutely, but the choice before voters was not vote ANC or go back to apartheid, right? And it was an attempt again to go back to this deeply rooted political narrative about who should be in charge and why. And these vary in different places, right? In Uganda, it's a narrative about, President Museveni and the NRM have been in charge since 1986. And the narrative is about, well, we delivered this country from the chaotic, politically violent years of Amin and Obote. We provide this security. And the slogan, this last round was protecting the gains. But Uganda is one of the youngest countries on earth. Again, most Ugandans have no lived experience of the years of Amin and Obote. But they have experienced corruption and some repression, and there is this huge grievance base there. So for the US, I think the lesson is to stop assuming that politics on the continent are going to look the way they've looked in the past. And we do that a lot. We think we know who's always going to be in charge. We think we understand, at a government level, we think we understand how the lay of the land might look. And I just think that we're casting our lot with a sort of increasingly obsolete paradigm if we continue in this fashion.
Another thing in here that I found really interesting, and we'll kind of move a bit more into where the youth are, kind of some more of their kind of demographics and what they're doing. But one aspect of having the oldest leaders in the world, Baye's 92, I guess. He makes, whether you like Biden or Trump in their 80s, makes them look like babes. But for the United States, I think a lot of times we're such an individualistic country. We excessively focus upon the youth. A lot of parts of the world think we don't have a reverence for our grandparents, for our elders. In Africa, that's an important part of the culture and context. And I thought almost one of the meanest and cruelest things is that so many of these presidents, you mentioned multiple instances, will dig at and kind of disparage the youth because they are not, quote unquote, an adult yet. And that is largely because of, if you can discuss it, it's the economic difficulties of they don't have access, despite having an education, to getting a decent job, to buy a reasonable place to live, to be able to support a spouse, support a family. Can you talk about the kind of cultural impact of how hard it is to, I hate to even say it, but become an adult in Africa in a society that has a reverence for elderly?
Sure, and there are sociologists and anthropologists who've done some really great work on this, and it varies. Different societies, different cultures, but in many cases, sort of adulthood is a social construction where you draw the line, right? Which is, it's always interesting to me when you see leaders of a party youth wing who are 45. You know, in my mind, that's, you're past your sell-by date as a youth leader. But in many cases, right, the social construction of what it is to have arrived at adulthood has something to do with, yes, perhaps having your own home, such as it is, which is incredibly difficult now that Africa is urbanizing so rapidly, right? Being able to marry, being able to have something to offer a spouse. And, you know, even in some of the most successful African economies like Kenya, right, more than 80% of people work in the informal economy. So it's, you know, it's not like you can offer your benefits or these signifiers, these markers of the stability phase of your life that's supposed to come with adulthood can be really elusive. And if you imagine that, and there's, again, been great work by people far smarter than I on this, it can take you in a number of different directions. It certainly helps to make young people more vulnerable to a lot of co-opting from political elites, but it can also lead to a real sense of emasculation, particularly for young men, you know, trapped in some kind of Peter Pan scenario gone terribly wrong, right? Where however hard you try, you can't seem to grow up. And we see, I think, some resonance of this if you are familiar at all with the junta leader in Burkina Faso. So Burkina is one of the Sahelian states that's recently experienced a military coup. Interestingly, when you poll populations in countries that have recently had these coups, and you ask the subset of people who say that they were supportive of the coup initially, and you ask them why, the number one reason, far and away, is it was time for a change. But his rhetoric is about dignity. And I think it is incredibly powerful. I'm not actually buying what he's selling necessarily, in that I think that Burkina Faso is incredibly repressive under his leadership. The security situation is not getting better. I don't think the Burkinabe are being treated with dignity. But I do think he's absolutely right about how incredibly important and politically salient that idea is. Not just in Burkina, but there's a reason he's become a sort of celebrated figure across the continent. Part of it is because Russia has a vigorous system of propagandists and an information campaign designed to elevate him. But part of it is because he's one of the youngest leaders on the continent, and he's speaking about young Africans and the dignity that should be their birthright, and that is incredibly resonant.
Turning, again to the youth, and I suppose the great positive sides of it. The difficulty is finding jobs. I think in the United States, for a number of years, if not the number one region, maybe number two region, where immigrants have the highest numbers of graduate degrees, I think, as immigrants come from Africa. Yeah. But looking at the urban youth across much of Africa, can you talk a little bit more, you touched upon it earlier, the kind of positive political side of it, despite the cynicism, which is understandable, but ethnicities or tribal groups that might have been separated in rural areas by great distances or even by languages are living closer together, interacting with each other, working with each other. Can you talk about those kind of benefits? And then because of social media and everything else, the ability to learn from and work with counterparts in other countries in the region.
Sure. Yes. By no means do I think that every change is going to be for the negative. I don't believe that at all. And I don't think that's borne out by the evidence. And there are some really kind of inspiring examples of youth-driven political change that, if you care about democracy, is moving in a far more democratic direction. So young people, I think, one thing that's really heartening is let's take Kenya and the last general election when President Ruto was elected. They had very, very poor voter turnout in that election, really kind of depressing numbers. And the takeaway for a lot of analysts was, all these young Kenyans, they're just so politically apathetic, and their fathers fought for multi-party democracy, which is true, and people sacrificed their lives for it, and now they just don't even care. But then we saw for the past 2 summers, massive youth uprisings with very clear and pointed demands at their government. So we sometimes confuse low voter turnout with political apathy, and they're not the same thing. These aren't politically apathetic young people. They didn't believe the choice before them in the election would make any difference. They saw sort of both leading candidates as part of the same system of political elites that they find to be self-serving. And while there are problems, with some of these uprisings and activist movements, there are also, they succeeded in getting a finance bill withdrawn and forced the government to sort of rethink the degree to which they could squeeze the Kenyan people for more revenues to pay off debts. They've raised very real and I think incredibly salient points around debt transparency, suggesting that no one should lend more money until anti-corruption measures are in place, and there should be no more secret deals with lenders that are not made public and available for public discussion. So some of these demands and trends are really, I think, positive, likely to strengthen a society. So it's not a case of just wanting to tear things down, but it is also true that it's much easier to organize across socioeconomic class, linguistic divides, religious divides, to advocate for change than it is to build the alternative, right? And I think about the uprising in Sudan in 2019, right, that ousted President Bashir. So this was something that had been a U.S. foreign policy goal for decades, right? At one point, we had one of the most comprehensive suites of sanctions in the world on the Sudanese government, trying to squeeze them essentially until their calculus became unworkable. And it didn't succeed, but young Sudanese, again, across all of these very serious divisions in Sudanese society, mobilized and made it impossible for that regime to continue. This is incredibly exciting. If you let yourself imagine what it would have looked like had the military not swept in to usurp that movement, the idea of a democratic Sudan helping to bridge the Arab and African worlds, it's incredibly exciting from a sort of long-term strategic perspective. So there are possibilities too, I think, inherent in the latent power, the latent political power of these young populations that are exciting, and that we have not spent any time as a government genuinely imagining and thinking about how we might support and work with them. We have sort of our templates in our mind about these countries and how it goes, and I think that the evidence is telling us we need to start broadening our horizons when we imagine our futures.
And just to reiterate what you mentioned in the book many times, it is out of desperation that there might be support for coups. And you mentioned whether it be in recent countries in the Sahel or other places, after they've been in power for a while, they equally are kind of unpopular oftentimes with the youth or everybody. But can you talk about, I suppose, just the reality that maybe we as Americans should count ourselves lucky that we have a functioning government, we have a democracy that works, we have available jobs, that whether it be in Afghanistan or in Zimbabwe or anywhere, if you don't have a job, if you have great economic and even security uncertainty, you mentioned the polling says we're willing to give up some of those rights just to have a bit of economic growth, and maybe that difficult decision that people are not giving up on democracy, but democracy is almost secondary to what they need.
Sure. Yeah, certainly for the Sahelian states, the primacy of security, the greatest number of deaths due to terrorist attacks for several years now, it's come from Africa. And particularly that Sahelian belt, people have suffered terribly. And so what you want is a government that can provide security, step one, right? And then you also want a job, and you want an end to corruption, and you want to believe that your national resources are being used in service of the population and not a tiny handful of elites or somebody in Paris. But what's interesting to me is the same kind of manifestations of enthusiasm and support that we read about in the news in the wake of these coups, right? It's I could almost write this story here. It's always, and the youth flooded the streets cheering and honking and raising the flag in celebration. That was exactly what the story was in the wake of the election of whoever got unseated by the coup, right? It's a desperate effort to keep trying something that might work. So there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm when there's something new on the horizon. And also, if you just had a military coup, it's maybe not the smartest thing to come, I'm not so sure that those who disapprove are likely to be waving banners right away as they assess the safety of the situation. But UNDP did some really great work on this, and the polls are pretty consistent. It's people prefer democracy, by and large, but the brand of democracy has been devalued on the continent because we've spent such a long time calling things like what happens in Cameroon democratic elections, or papering over constitutional coups where leaders change the constitution to ensure they can stay in power. And so, well, if that's what democracy is, it's hard to say you want to, sacrifice for that. And they just want government that can deliver. Now, interestingly, this notion that you have to choose, right, between an effective government and a democratic government, there are major powers very eager to reinforce that narrative. And so that the China model of governance is one that is often brought up by Chinese diplomats and others as a example of how you can get more done, lift more people out of poverty, because China has, done an extraordinary job lifting its population out of poverty. If you just set aside all this bickering and go with the plan.
And just to pick up on that, I suppose a lot of people probably wouldn't be surprised. Understandable, difficult, often brutal, repressive colonial histories, the French in particular, sometimes the British, not always seen in the best light. The United States, for understandable reasons, we think of apartheid, sadly, it took an act of Congress to override Reagan's veto for the U.S. As late as the 1980s to break from apartheid. But the other two players you're referencing, we discussed China already. Looking at, and maybe we'll get back to China, but looking at Russia, can you talk about two ways they're incredibly, I suppose, instrumental in terms of, we think about disinformation campaigns, sowing discord or kind of uncertainty or disinformation, and then a much more directly ruthless model. I think of the Wagner Group. People might remember Evgeny Prigozhin having a, I guess, predictable accident or whatever you'd like to call it. He may have died in that unfortunate plane crash that surprised a lot of people. Not really. 2 years ago. But the Wagner Group kept going, and if anything, they expanded operations in Africa even more, supporting some of these same coup leaders we're talking about, extracting huge amounts of wealth, especially in gold and other minerals. Can you talk about those two sides of Russian influence in the region?
Sure, because they are connected. So Russia, which had been sort of dormant in many ways on the continent for a long time, besides arms sales, Africa's very much a part of Russia's strategy to reassert itself as a global power. And from the Central African Republic to the Sahelian states to its constantly on again, off again access to a base in Port Sudan, which would dramatically change how easy it would be for them to project power in one of the most sensitive shipping lanes in the world. Russia is quite bullish about the gains to be made in Africa, and it's opportunistic. So in the case of Mali or Burkina, you see these states that have been struggling with violent extremism, the problem getting bigger and bigger, the amount of territory the state actually controls shrinking, and there's a coup, and Russia is ready to offer its security services to help them, whereas the U.S., has to cut off a lot of assistance by law because of the unconstitutional transfer of power. Well, what Russia provides, what Africa Corps, which is what we call the same people who were part of the Wagner Group before, provides is really regime security. So they can protect the junta in the capital, but they have not succeeded in turning back any of these extremist groups. And their efforts to engage those groups often come with an awful lot of civilian casualties. So it's a bet on the powers that be, which I think in the long run is a bad bet. And I think also the sort of demonstration of Russia's inability to solve the fundamental security problem. So, again, they can protect the regime and maybe the capital city, but, in Mali, if insurgents are essentially surrounding it, making it impossible for fuel to get into Bamako, that there are limits to the value of that. But Russia persists, and Russia and China have found some common cause in this broad, slightly vague argument about the international order, that it's been unjust, it's been stacked in favor of the West, and that's why BRICS should be so appealing to African states. It's strange to me to have two Security Council permanent veto members arguing about how the rules are unfair to them. But this has some traction on the continent. And so you have the Russian military piece, you have the propaganda piece, which emphasizes this idea that sort of it's the global South and Russia that can create a new and more just order. But it's a very targeted set of campaigns too. So for example, when in Senegal, the Macky Sall's government, President Sall, was essentially trying to find ways to stay in power. So there were postponements and threats of constitutional manipulations, and there were a lot of public demonstrations demanding that regular order be followed. People lost their lives. Throughout all of this, there was an incredibly concerted and intense Moscow-backed campaign on social media, to suggest to young Senegalese that they should do what their Burkinabe brothers and sisters had done, and let the military take control. And now Senegal is not Burkina, right? And this was the democratic roots in Senegal run much deeper. And there was an amazing amount of savvy that you saw too in Senegalese social media, calling out these accounts, connecting them to known Russia-backed media mouthpieces, and really insisting that they too were furious with France. And they agreed that the Western-backed rules-based international order was unjust. And they had no interest in a military coup. And they wanted their democracy to sustain itself. I mean, really quite extraordinary. In some cases at the cost of their lives. That's the kind of thing that, for me, if I ruled the world, and I definitely shouldn't, I would be thinking hard, not because I have some kind of ideological affinity for the new government of Senegal, because they eventually did get their election and they did unseat the party that had been in charge. And guess what? Those newly elected, pretty young leaders come to power, and they want to deliver on their promises. They promised change. They want to deliver. You know what they found hiding under the rug? Even more debt than they already knew about. Billions more debt. It was secret. And if we want these countries to be stable partners, thinking about how you lean in to help a partner like that, instead of relying on this G20 common framework for debt relief, which is, unbelievably slow, might be a place to start.
And just a little follow-up on that. You mentioned China, obviously, in terms of economic models. China looks much more promising than the Russian model, incredibly effective, the greatest economic growth really the world has ever seen. But in terms of the narrative, Xi and Putin will both say we are pushing back joint, anti-colonial forces, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, Europeans have a long and checkered history. Americans, you think of the Philippines, or you think of Cuba, ourselves. But you mentioned Senegalese looking past the kind of distractions of the Russians. Are there any you say, well, wait a second, the Russians, Tsarist Russia, that was one of the largest empires in the world, the colonial empire. Roughly half the people in Russia are ethnic Russians. China, the ethnic Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the people from northern Upper Mongolia, conquered people. Is there no sense that they are also colonial powers?
Not much. Not much of a sense of that. There's an interesting discourse around territorial aggression, certainly in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But no, I think by and large there is not a sense that those are colonial powers. But that doesn't mean that everybody's just kind of buying into somebody else's model, hook, line, and sinker, right? There's a lot of discernment. China has come to the rescue of some governments, and China has been a major issue, electoral issue that has led some governments not to be elected. So it's a mixed bag. And look, Chinese engagement in some places has helped with critical transportation infrastructure that is part of the recipe for how you are going to actually create jobs and attract investment. And it's not like only Chinese vehicles drive on those roads, right? So some of it has been unquestionably positive. But the Chinese model and the Russian model depend on elite relationships, right? That's why there's hidden debt. And when we think about competition, not that this is, some kind of smorgasbord of spoils for us to try and grab for ourselves, but when we think about influence and dealing with other powers who are explicitly trying to diminish U.S. influence, I think it's a huge mistake to adopt a similar model of transactions with sets of political elites, because it really puts us at odds with where these young populations want to see their societies go.
A good question here from Raymond. He asked, could technology like AI, distance learning, and remote work relieve some of the youthful discontent? And just picking up on a thread from the book, something else is equally kind of challenging that this cohort doesn't have, that others don't have, is there probably will never be a big manufacturing wave in Africa. There was not the Industrial Revolution that grew the population but provided millions of jobs in the United States or England or obviously East Asia, China, Southeast Asia. What's a way to kind of maybe hopefully bridge that gap, especially if Africa probably cannot depend upon manufacturing because of automation and other reasons the way other developing countries have?
Right. So I am not a labor economist, but I've talked to a bunch of them trying to figure this out. And the short answer is I don't know. I don't know how you solve for the job creation challenge before so many of these governments. AI, technology can generate some jobs and has. You look at sort of the Silicon Savannah in Kenya, some of the big tech startups in Nigeria. There's significant tech scene in Ghana and in South Africa, but it is not creating jobs at the scale that one would need. And is it possible that in the future somehow this happens? Maybe. But do you remember when we were all going to future of work conferences? It's about a decade ago, a lot of future of work conversations as we were worried about automation. Who was almost never invited to the future of work conferences? Africans, right? Where the challenge is so much bigger for them. So I am not convinced that there's going to be some magical boom of new tech jobs that's going to ease this pressure. Remote work, yes, and Africans do it, but it's often, if you think about the number of East Africans who've worked for social media companies and their job is to screen the worst of the worst videos to make sure they don't get posted and available for everyone. They're paid very little. They're lawsuits right now. They're traumatized by this. Right? It's kind of the worst work in many ways that's happening. And this is something that I worry about all the time. There are governments in Africa who encourage their young people to go abroad for work. This is something that happens in Kenya. And too often what happens is these young people go abroad and are exploited. Their passports are seized by their employer. They have no real labor rights. And the idea of sort of exporting African labor to go work abroad with fewer rights than the citizens of the country in which they work. This is, I think, this should ring some bells for all of us and not be something that we're eager to see repeated. So I'm concerned that we are not all collectively seized with the incredible job creation challenge on the continent.
I'm just going to put these two questions together and then one for conclusion. And again, please join us afterwards. Kind of example of the receptions we have for our upper level donors, the Council Cabinet members. We're always very grateful and lucky to have all of you. Please join us afterwards with Ambassador Gavin. But I'm just going to put these two questions together because they're rather related. The first one doesn't have a name, that's fine, but it says, could you talk about the impact of U.S. withdrawing aid from Africa, in particular how that might impact the economy or the development of the economy. And then Rolf asks kind of a similar kind of capacity in terms of U.S. policies. What are the developments in Africa that you think are most important to look out for over the next, next 2 decades, and how do you explain to the American people why those are important?
Sure. Okay. So maybe working backwards, the kind of why does Africa matter question. Well, when you think about places where the U.S. had provided massive amounts of foreign assistance in the past, places like Korea or Japan, these places became incredibly important markets for the U.S. So we're about to be at the point where 1 in every 4 people on the planet is African. And there is a reason that other major powers and middle powers in their grand strategies have a very clear view about why they need to be engaged in Africa. We're the ones who continue to sort of imagine it's kind of some kind of side venture that isn't going to be central to the global economy going forward. So I think now there is certainly an interest in the critical minerals that are abundant on the continent, but it's not just about that. It's about markets, right? Markets for goods and services. I think also there are good reasons to be concerned about some of the radical extremist organizations that do operate on the continent and that have explicitly aspired to, and in some cases have, attacked the homeland, attacked the U.S. So there are, but I'm always loath to pose this, just in the form of threats, right? Africa, keep a lid on it or it's going to come bite us. There are also all of these opportunities, right, to think differently. Go back to indulging and imagining a democratic Sudan, the way that would ease the pressure on the U.S. relationship with Egypt, the things that might be possible then. It's difficult to see in any kind of multilateral system how 54 votes can just be written off. This is another thing that China is quite seized with. So there are lots of, I think, very good reasons for the U.S. to care. Help me out, what were the...
Impact upon, especially economic impact of the withdrawal of U.S. aid.
Okay, yes. So why did we take some of the tools in our foreign policy toolbox and toss them in the dumpster? I don't understand that. It is on the continent, there is less outcry, in part because populations say, I hope this puts more pressure on our leadership to do what they should be doing, right? Delivering services for people. In part because leaders don't want to look as though they were dependent on some foreign entity to provide what is necessary. And in part because there is a power dynamic in a donor-recipient relationship that nobody loved, that felt patronizing sometimes. And so people can be incredibly dismayed at the job losses, at the lack of support for organizations, and most critically, the way we pulled the rug out from under people on healthcare. But the reaction on the ground, I think, is in some ways muted and complicated. Because people have very complicated feelings about that assistance. But there is no question that lives have been lost, will continue to be lost. There is no question that our withdrawal from that kind of work, I think, will make us less informed and less aware of what's going on at a societal level, right? You get a very different idea about Cameroon if you just, well, you're not gonna meet with Paul Biya because he spends all his time in Geneva in the Intercon, but if you just meet with some senior government officials, right, and head out, then if there are parts of your system that are out there talking to people in clinics and talking to journalists who are, trying to figure out how to navigate the rules and not get arrested. So I think we're doing ourselves a tremendous disservice.
Before this last question, again, like I said, we will have a reception next door. For those of you, I think we're sold out of your book, which is great. If you don't mind signing some of the books back there quickly, and then I'm going to steal and bring you over there. And just to let you know, we have other events, but just 2 or 3 in the next few weeks of February. Next week, on February 11th, something kind of different and interesting. Pope Leo, the first American pope, and I always think American as in the United States. Latin Americans, that would be Pope Francis. But we'll be looking at Pope Leo, Pope Francis, and really kind of the global role that's often kind of unknown or kind of beneath the waves that the Vatican and the papacy still has. You think in terms of U.S. negotiations with Cuba, hopefully perhaps even say negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And then week after that, or 2 weeks after that, we're kind of packed. February 24th, as Jahan mentioned, former U.S. Special Envoy Roger Carstens, ambassador, and impressive person himself, a very difficult position. He was the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, so a lot of those key hostage negotiations or exchanges, I would say he is one of the few people, I can think of like Ambassador John Sullivan as well, who has kept and worked between both Biden and Trump's administrations, because highly respected by both sides. And then the day after, we have Samuel Katz, a best-selling journalist and author, talking about Mossad, and in particular Mir Dagan, and kind of how he revolutionized Mossad and its ongoing role in Israel, especially in terms of its dealing with Iran. And then to finish it in honor of our 250th birthday party for the country, we're hosting a Pulitzer Prize winner, John Meacham, who's, I think, one of the best American historians we have currently. But a great question here, I feel bad asking you, because you have worked your entire professional career on or related to Africa. But as the former ambassador to Botswana, great question, and I know you could talk for 5 hours on this question, but it's a great way to say there are bright spots. There's Botswana, there's Ghana, there's Senegal, you mentioned Kenya. Harry asks, can you talk about Botswana and its kind of long and historic democracy and how and why it's kind of been so successful?
Could I? I promise I won't go on too long, but Botswana really is extraordinary, right? This small population, landlocked country that's done what no small population landlocked country had ever done, and gone from the bottom of every development index at independence in 1966 to an upper middle income country that has been a peaceful democracy throughout its independence. That's a heck of a thing, right? It's really amazing. And I think it's not just about diamonds, right? South Africa has diamonds, Angola has diamonds, Zimbabwe has diamonds. It's about the way they have governed to ensure that that diamond wealth redounds to the people of Botswana. You can see it in the roads you drive on. You can taste it in the water you can drink out of the tap. This commitment to reinvesting in the country is something I admire so deeply. And it's not that it's a perfect society, right? It's a human society, so it's definitely not. But this is a place in a really tough neighborhood. They do border Angola and South Africa and Zimbabwe. It's not an easy neighborhood that has its own deeply rooted senses of accountability, of holding leaders accountable. There's something called the Hotla system, which looks to an American an awful lot like a town hall, where leadership comes before a community, and then they stay until they've answered everyone's questions. It's a place where they have been pioneers in conservation, where they have lowered their mother-to-child transmission rate of HIV to the lowest rate in the world. They do better than we do at this. Very, I think, important element of prevention. And so I think it's just an extraordinary place, and they've had, I think they were blessed by some very strong founding leadership and then successive presidents that continued with this ethic of let's build strong institutions, and let's make sure this diamond wealth doesn't end up in somebody's yacht in the Mediterranean, but rather right here in Botswana.
That was excellent, and will you all please join me in thanking Ambassador Michelle Gavin. Thank you. Great.